Science for Everyday Decisions, series by Center for Sustainable Development at the Earth Institute, Columbia University. For your consideration for a more sustainable life through education for sustainable development.
It's great to be talking to Bob Jickling, who I think is a thought leader in the field of environmental education, and at least for me has given me a lot of inspiration and a lot of thinking through environmental education and how it evolved. So thanks, Bob, for spending some time with us, and it's really been an honor to talk to you and so we have prepared very difficult questions for you on environmental education for sustainable development, because we feel that you will have all the right answers for us. So just to give a quick background, Professor Bob Jickling is a professor of education at Lakehead University in Ontario and has been working in the field of environmental education for more than 30 years. So my first question for you, Bob, is in these 30 years, do you think environmental education has moved from where it was to where it is now? And what are some of the hopes that we can get on shaping our future based on the evolution of environmental education that you've seen? And also, if you can touch upon this field of education for sustainable development, do you think that there is some distinction there? And I know you've written a lot about the frameworks of environmental education and education for sustainable development, but maybe just briefly describe the evolution for us and some of the tensions you feel between the two concepts.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. I don't think any of us really have all the answers, but I think what we probably need more than anything is encouragement to look in places where we haven't looked before. And so I think we need to, and so that's a nice segue into where we're at with environmental education in a way. I think one of the things that environmental education and education for sustainable development share are a concern for the interhuman relationships and the planetary relationships, and I think all of us actually share a common concern, even though we may disagree about how we want to move forward and get there. And I think we also share something a little less fortunate, and that there's a certain amount of failure that we have to address and acknowledge that is within these respective fields, and trying to figure out what it looks like, what this failure is constituted of, and trying to figure out how we maybe need to change course a little bit, and maybe refocus questions, maybe expand our imaginations a little bit. On the plus side, though, it's thinking about where we were when I first started this work and where we are now. I see hundreds more people involved, thousands more people involved. I see a lot more people working hard. There's a lot more research published than there ever was before. It's become very much more complex, complicated. There are a lot of people thinking about environmental education, thinking about issues like climate change, and I think that there's a couple of ways of looking at that in a positive light. One is perhaps with so many voices of expressing care and concern, we're creating a greater context for perhaps making a breakthrough. And there's just a lot of individual teachers out there doing their very best to try and create openings, work openings for their students, their children, their learners to see the world in a little bit different ways. And so I think those things are incredibly positive and hopeful. On the other hand, the thing that we have to start thinking about and figuring out a little bit more about is why it is that education writ large, so if we put everybody together, and that includes these wonderful teachers, but it includes the whole system, so we wonder why it is that it's so many efforts in some tend to bend back towards the status quo. And why is it that we don't get real traction for change? And so I think that is that's a pretty fundamental question. So we might ask uh, of environmental education, have our efforts up till now, collectively, not isolating individuals, have they done more to reinforce the status quo, or have they done more to disrupt it? And I think we would need to ask the same question of education for sustainable development. Um, does this do more to this concept as a guiding light, I guess? Does it do more to reinforce the status quo, or does it really have the potential to seriously disrupt it? And in both cases, I think we need to do more. Now, on the differences between the two, um, I don't think either of them has got a monopoly on a correct vision. Even though I choose to work more within environmental education, I don't think either's got it nailed. The one thing I do like about environmental education, and it's maybe the only real thing, is that I think by using environmental as an adjective, it's drawing our attention, I think, to something that's missing, fundamentally missing in education. It's drawing our attention to something. Environment may not be the best word. I love the influx of some of the other words that people are using these days, place-based or nature-based or forest school. There's a lot of people now trying to get back to realizing that there's something that more in the real world that needs to be included. And so I think environment it's a word that I think is disruptive. It's not maybe disruptive in all the ways that it needs to be, and that would be my concern about it. But it's a disruptive word. When people start talking about environmental concerns, the status quo gets anxious, and so in that very way, I think that's not bad. Education for sustainable development is, I think, constructed a little bit differently. I think it assumes that there is a concept around which we should all be rallying, and it represents, well, the way it's being presented these days is it represents an unquestioned truth. If you look at UNESCO documents and other people that are most what could you say, most vigorously adhering to this idea, it's as if there isn't another way of going about this other than subsuming everything by that term. And I'll just say one more thing, then please lead on to where you want to go. But just one last thing about the divergence of these ideas a little bit. And I guess around the time of the Rio conference, there was a shift in education to a more critical approach, leaving behind in some ways the real world, the existential world, moving ever more into a political world. And at the time, I thought there were some really interesting discussions coming into our field of environmental education. I know that deep ecology is sometimes critiqued, but I think in some ways some of those critiques are a little tawdry. I think there still was a lot of good work that could be had by exploring those ideas. Notwithstanding, there were some critical points to consider, and there was an enormous amount of work coming from the ecofeminists that was making its way into our conversations in environmental education, and then there were others too. So I thought that the conversation was beginning to open up in quite rich ways, quite potentially disruptive ways, and then came sustainable development, around which we were all supposed to adhere. And I get the feeling, now I don't have empirical evidence to back this up. I don't think, I'd have to hunt around, but I get the feeling that our conversation is narrowed rather than broadened with that move a little bit. And I think it's taken us away from those very fundamental questions about what really is missing in education? What are we doing so fundamentally incorrectly that we can't address uh, issues like climate change more effectively with education?
Mhm. Thank you, Bob. I think you've given me already a lot of things to think of, and so I'm still trying to assimilate all that information. But just to get at that point of education for sustainable development is very agenda driven and has narrowed the vision. So I feel that I have a contrary view to that. That ESD seems much more broad. Like if you see the Sustainable Development Goal target 4.7, it seems more like global citizenship, and we talk of all the other things, but it seems much more addressing all the four pillars: social, we have economic, we have environment, we have peace and security in terms of the sustainable development framework. So how do you think that it has narrowed the environmental education focus when we talk of the education for sustainable development?
Okay, first of all, I think that all of those issues that you speak about are issues that you would find um, uh, issues of concern for people working within an environmental education too. I think that I don't think I think that social issues have always been an integral part of environmental education. I think as questions of social justice, I think questions of social justice um, became more to the fore for everybody at the same time. And I think there was a lot of rhetoric within sustainable development suggesting that sustainable development made that happen. But in fact, I think it was more of a social awareness um, more broadly. And as it became ever more prominent in public discourse, I think people in environmental education developed ever more concern for the same issues. So I think so. I don't think there's a that's not the distinction I would choose to make. But what I do have a little trouble with in Goal 4.7 is the opening statement. It says, to by 2030, we need to ensure that all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. Well, first of all, promoting sustainable development, why not deep ecology or why not something else? Why does it have to be that? That's one thing. But the more important thing is um, that's an idea of education that hasn't changed in a long time. Some of the rhetoric around sustainable development is the need for new visions, new approaches, and something fundamentally transformative. But in fact, that language is exactly the language, give or take a word or two, that was presented in the Belgrade Charter in 1977.
Wow.
The idea of what constitutes knowledge and understanding hasn't evolved an iota. In fact, I find that statement, quite frankly, banal. It's we've people that have been working hard with around issues of transformative education or social learning have been doing all kinds of things that fall outside of the scope of that. But I guess more fundamentally, it suggests that we can actually know what knowledge is required, and we can actually know what skills are required, and we can somehow just insert those into education. People will automatically um, do what we want them to do. In this case, care about um, climate change. And of course, at this time, as we're approaching something that some people are calling the Anthropocene, we don't actually have any idea what we need to do. We're entering a phase in human history and global history that we've never experienced before. We've never experienced the possibility of environmental catastrophe and mass extinctions in the same kinds of ways. And all that we've done in the past, like following the same old prescriptions, um, uh, are, are seem to me more likely to reinforce the status quo than actually be disruptive.
Mhm.
So this is a standard industrial kind of prescription for learning. we talk about how so much our education system is kind of based on an industrial revolution kind of model, and that language is exactly that. So, and that I think tends to, it assumes that we can know what we can set out to achieve, and that it is relatively simple matter. But in fact, I think that, well, first of all, let me just say that in his book Liquid Modernity, Zygmunt Bauman does a nice job of just mocking this approach to education. I see I think it's in the forward to the 2030 document that the then director of UNESCO, Maria Barkova, essentially talks in one sentence about the need for fundamentally reshaping education, and the other sense she trots out a bit of rhetoric that's essentially the same as this. And that's the kind of rhetoric that runs through much of environment, not all, but much of environmental education to this very day. And that's, I think, holds it back to it just has little overtones of instrumentalism and behaviorism that I find not helpful and not progressive. So the idea that there are things, issues like gender equality and human rights are important. I don't think anybody with a pulse and an iota of care would disagree with those kinds of things. So it's not those things that are at issue here. Although I would say that when I look through the whole Agenda 30 suite of ideas and imperatives, I would say that they do tend, in my view, to be very heavily anthropocentric or human-centered, and I think that is probably a fundamental problem right there. But if that part was addressed, I still think these are the kinds of things that any caring person, more or less, would agree with. We might put different rank them differently in terms of our priorities, but that's fine. That's fine too. As Arne Ness used to say, the frontier is long. There's lots of work to do. But how do we? What do we actually do educationally to make this stuff work? And that's my concern. It's not so much trying to focus on human rights or gender equality or global citizenship, but what's really missing that keeps us from making any progress on these things. And I think that when we start looking at those kinds of questions, then maybe some of the other stuff will fall into, well, I'd like to think that it will fall into place, but we know how terribly hard change is.
So in terms of what is missing, I want to draw your attention to this, to your approach of wild pedagogies, and it aims to be very disruptive, and you urge us to think about the relationship between education and environment in a very different way. So can you explain your wild pedagogy a little bit more and tell us if that could be something that education should strive to be, so that we can achieve the SDG goals, sustainable development goals for education?
Let's just think about the climate, put it in the terms of climate change just for a moment, but I think this applies to all the other things. Quite a few years ago, I had the opportunity to do a series of interviews with Arne Ness, the Norwegian philosopher, the fellow that coined the term deep ecology. One of the things that's always struck me that he said was, he said, we've got more than enough science to know that we need to change our ways, but we don't. And so that was always brought me back to the kind of question, why don't people care? And is there something that's missing in the kind of education that's generally presented, kind of a globalized or Western, or there's a number of descriptors for it, but a globalized education? What's missing, really? So that's a first piece, and what's holding us back. And so this business of what is required in order for people to actually care seems to be a fairly important question. It's tied in with things like ethics, and it's tied in, I suppose it's tied in with psychological dimensions, so that's not, I'm not an expert in that. So, so we begin with that. So, so wild pedagogies, I suppose, I think one of the things that unites the wild part of it and the pedagogy part of it is concern about issues of control. How is it that education is controlled in ways that it tends to so often bend us back in directions of the status quo? And why is it so hard to see that and make changes? So the first and foremost, there's some epistemological questions. They're about the limited. In what ways is the range of knowledge that's available for our students narrowed in a way that it doesn't that we miss out on a lot. And so we think about how the way curriculum is developed. It's defined by fairly limited range of objectives. It tends to be highly for the most part. I know there's some lovely teachers out there that are doing fantastic things to work against this next point, but it's when it comes right down to it, the curriculum is rooted in a lot of abstraction. In many cases, you know, it denies human physicality and the fact and the learning that accrues through doing things actually in a real world. There's one colleague of mine that once talked about the physicality of humans, and he said that when we take very young children and we put them into classrooms, we're denying their physicality. And he said, "Isn't that a bit like breaking horses?" You know, so when we put such an emphasis on a narrow conception, maybe of rationality, we're denying the somatic learning, the sensuous learning, or at least if we're not denying it totally, because there's a lot of people doing some wonderful work, at the very least, we're minimizing its importance. If you can't, some of those things defy measurement as far as I can see, and if you can't measure it, it just doesn't count in a globalized kind of curriculum. And so, so I think just at root here, there's a need to broaden what counts as learning and knowing and knowledge, and in all of that, there's an imperative to take the idea of feelings more seriously, and allow room for people to build their idea of understanding the world in a way that makes room for the stuff that's all been packaged up and pushed to the side under this kind of abstract term, the affect. But in reality, it's so curriculum is controlled in such a way that it puts those things to the margins, and so that would be one idea of wilding curriculum, would be to try and make a little room for more uncontrolled, undefined, more expressive learning. I like the years ago, Elliot Eisner coined this term, expressive learning, and for him, it was the idea that we create good learning opportunities with good content, and students will make different meanings out of that, and they will express themselves through those experiences in ways that defy concrete or limited learning outcomes and objectives. We'll interact with that. We can interact with our world in much more expressive ways that release people's imaginations rather than constrict them. So that's one thing, to be ever more conscious of the ways that we are bending back in the direction of a more narrow set of possibilities for education. And I guess the other piece of this is the way that we tend to control our understanding of the rest of the world, the more than human world. And it seems to me that unless we have a different kind of relationship with the more than human world, it's going to be difficult to care about it in a way that can open opportunities for meaningful change. And so the two parts, I guess, two of the parts of this idea of wild pedagogies is to be ever more aware of the kinds of things that are controlling us and tending to bend what we do in the classrooms back in the direction of the status quo. And the second thing is to have to seek ways of understanding what a different kind of relationship might be with the more than human world. One where we might think of the more than human world as actually co-teacher rather than object for study, but co-teacher, co-inhabitant. We might think of ourselves as plain citizens, as somebody once said, in an ecosphere, rather than the dominant, controlling pieces of it. So we're trying to. So I think I've already talked about needing to question our ideas about what counts as worthwhile knowledge. So that would be an epistemological question, and I think we need to maybe adjust the ways that we live in the world. Our being, and this takes us into possibilities for different kind of ontological relationships with the world. So at the root here, I think that the way we are in the world, the way we be in the world is probably problematic, and the scope for how we're permitted to think about being in the world is probably way too narrow.
So your thoughts regarding the wild pedagogies is actually very similar to my experiences, or is contradictory to my experiences in India. While I was growing up, I am from Bhopal, and we had the 1984 gas tragedy. So in school, we were not taught about the gas tragedy in terms of this uncontrolled learning aspect, because everything had to have an answer. The teacher needed to have an answer. So we were taught about like which gas was released, so you had an answer. There was nothing in terms of let us co-learn things, or there may be things that may not be that may not have immediate answers, and that we all need to reflect, and that you mentioned that we all need to cohabit, and then that the teacher itself is like a co-learner along with the students themselves. And so my question is whether this uncontrolled learning that you are talking of, or the education, the disruption that you're talking of, will that leave the teacher in a very in a situation where she is trying to facilitate learning but will not have answers to most of the questions? Because it's sustainable development. If you take any issue, it becomes such a complex issue. Like Bhopal gas tragedy had an environment issue, it had a law issue, it had social issue, it has gender issues, so many different things. It had governance issues. There may not be answers to it, and there may not be any textbooks to follow. So in that case, what are we looking at in terms of the teacher? Like, I don't think any teacher will be comfortable being in that situation where you are trying to have this kind of a learning atmosphere, where you're trying to connect local issue, but you don't have any guidance. And how should you, combine things together and make that classroom environment a learning environment?
Well, there's a lot there. First of all, I'm not suggesting that everything people do in classrooms is wild and uncontrolled. I think what I'm saying is that there's some things in terms of the scope of possibilities that are perhaps sidelined. And so it's not, Val Plumwood used to say, it's not so much a matter of pushing down the top side of a binary or of a distinction. Sometimes it's a matter of lifting up the underside. And so maybe what we're not trying to do, I'm not suggesting that we're going to heave everything out. I'm suggesting maybe we need to, at the very least, lift up the underside, the part, the left out part. So in the first place, maybe that's maybe that's a simple piece to this. So we allow opportunities for learning in ways in places that are just awkward to evaluate, difficult to know what the outcomes will be, but still they seem to be worthwhile learning experiences. For example, I live in the Yukon, and there's a and the demographic is such that in my teaching, my learning, my colleagues, my friends, there is a higher proportion of interactions between people like myself and the indigenous people of this place. And when I used to teach at the college here, I had quite a few people that used to come to my classes and talk a little bit about the worldview that arose in which they were raised, and provided ideas that sometimes were in many ways fundamentally challenging to the ideas in education that I grew up with. And for example, in terms of this, the kind of thing that might be difficult to know what to do with in a school system that's lined up around evidence-based assessment and so on, were the ideas of interacting with elders and hearing their stories. And people many times with different people came into my classroom, and at one stage or another, there was a lot of people would have recounted an incident where they met with an elder who told them a story. And then they would say it would maybe be 10 years later that they finally understood why that elder told that story to me at that time. And so the business of telling a story isn't necessary. I mean, there are different kinds of stories, so I don't want to essentialize all stories, but many of the kinds of stories that were being related by these colleagues were stories where there wasn't necessarily a prescription, but they were designed to do work. So they weren't a prescription, but they were something that the receiver of the story could work with and use it as a tool to work his way through whatever particular issue that it was troubling him or her in their lives at the time. And so so if you were to think about providing it as experience, it could be with somebody like an elder. It could be an experience in wilderness. It might be experience working in a place where an NGO, for example, working with an NGO, for example, that was concerned with gender equity issues or poverty issues. But these experiences will have I think provide learning opportunities that just simply cannot exist in a classroom, and yet it may be quite some time before you really understand what the effect might have been and the transformative effect might have been for a lot of students, and would be pretty hard to measure that at the time. Or if we say, oh, these guys have had a transformative experience, well, you don't really know that. You just don't know if somebody's had a transformative experience unless it has changed the way they live their lives 10 years down the road. Really, transformative experiences, we use that term in a pretty sloppy way a lot of time, but when it comes to the kind of transformative experiences that are fundamental and lasting, it takes a while to know.
Which leads to my next question in terms of cross-pollination of ideas and this role of comparative international education in environmental education. So can we learn from each other's experiences, or are they too different? Or how should this environmental education be perceived in terms of comparative international education field?
Well, the first part of the question about cross-pollination, I'll deal with that. That one I know I understand the best, I think, and I think it feeds right into the second part of the question. And I guess it's really important. It's really important, and that goes back to my original concerns when education for sustainable development became the primary focus. when that happened, I think a lot of conversation around deep ecology and ecofeminism, not completely, but a lot of it bled away, and so much emphasis was given to sustainable development. And I thought the cross-pollination of ideas is exactly what education should be about. Rather than making a sustainable development the end goal, I thought that the idea that we should be talking about it was legitimate, but making it a superordinate goal when the conversations that were coming out of ecofeminism at the time, deep ecology, there was people were talking about. There was a fellow, Jim Chaney, that wrote a piece on postmodern ethics, and he talked about it in terms of bioregional narrative. There was a lot of lovely stuff that was, I thought, cross-pollinating, and there was another lovely paper in the late 1990s on etiquette and ethics-based epistemology. So think about that. What would it be like if our whole system of knowledge was rooted in an ethical approach to start with? I mean, those things are totally disruptive, and so I found that a lot of the kind of cross-pollination. Well, and this is not empirical. I don't have evidence, strong evidence to support the claim. It's more anecdotal in my own experiences. But I thought that if we put sustainable development alongside of some of these other ideas, then we would have had a much richer cross-pollination, and education wouldn't be about a particular end. It would be about the development of human beings that were more capable, had the emotional and the cognitive and the emotional range to be able to better handle these kind of complex questions that we're coming up against just now. So yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And environmental education has in its own way, perhaps not always been as open as it maybe could have been at times, especially to these epistemological and ethical and ontological questions that I'm talking about. I think there's, even in environmental education, while there was a huge emphasis on political questions, particularly in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and still to this day, the emphasis has been so often on solving the political questions rather than developing the kinds of human beings that have the capacity to take them